England, spring of 1819. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. George's Church on Hanover Square, casting jeweled patterns across the marble floors where 400 members of London's highest society had gathered to witness what many called the marriage of pity. The pews rustled with silk and whispered speculation as the guests craned their necks toward the entrance, waiting for the bride, whose face no one had seen in 8 years. At the altar stood Lord Julian Ravenscroft, Duke of Winterborn, his jaw tight with the resignation of a man who had made peace with his fate. At 31, he possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that came from an ancient bloodline, sharp cheekbones, ice-blue eyes, and hair the color of autumn wheat. Yet his immaculate morning coat could not disguise the tension in his shoulders, nor could his carefully composed expression hide the faint shadows beneath his eyes. He had not slept properly in weeks. The organ swelled. Julian's hands clenched at his sides as he prepared himself for what was to come. He had agreed to this arrangement with his eyes open, knowing he would bind himself to a woman whose face bore the terrible scars of an accident that had horrified society years ago. It was a transaction, £100,000 and £5,000 annually in exchange for his title and name. His dukedom would survive. That was all that mattered. Or so he had convinced himself in the dark hours before dawn. If you believe in stories where everything you expect is turned upside down in a single moment, subscribe now and join us on this extraordinary journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The church doors opened. Lady Camilla Worthington appeared in the doorway, and the collective intake of breath from 400 guests created a sound like wind through autumn leaves. But it was not horror that caused it. She moved down the aisle with the measured grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of composure. Her wedding gown was exquisite, layers of ivory silk and Brussels lace that caught the light with each step, but it was the veil that commanded attention. 5 layers of the finest tulle cascaded from a coronet of pearls, completely obscuring her face in a cloud of white that seemed almost architectural in its density. It was a veil designed to conceal, not to tantalize. Julian watched her approach, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Behind him he heard Lord Trenton, his closest friend, shift uncomfortably. The murmurs had already begun. "Poor creature," someone whispered. "To think of what she once was," came another voice, heavy with false sympathy. "The Duke is noble to accept such a match," a third added, and Julian felt his jaw clench tighter. Camilla reached the altar. Through the veil, Julian could discern only the barest outline of a face, a shadow that revealed nothing. Her gloved hands were steady as she passed her bouquet to her attendant. The Archbishop of Canterbury cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the hushed church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God." Julian barely heard the words. His mind was already calculating. The marriage would be consummated as required by law, conducted in darkness with the minimum intimacy necessary. They would maintain separate residences within Winterborn Hall. She would manage the household. He would manage the estates. It would be a partnership of necessity, nothing more. The ceremony proceeded with solemn gravity. Julian spoke his vows first, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I, Julian Frederick Ravenscroft, take thee, Camilla Rose Worthington, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." The words felt hollow, a legal formality spoken over a woman whose face he could not even see. Camilla's voice followed, clear and composed through the layers of tulle. "I, Camilla Rose Worthington, take thee, Julian Frederick Ravenscroft, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and to obey, till death us do part." With steady hands she drew off her left glove, revealing slender fingers that trembled only slightly. Julian slid the ring onto her bare finger, the Winterborn sapphire that had graced the hands of duchesses for 200 years. Through the veil he could see only the barest outline of her hand, but he felt the warmth of her skin as the ring settled into place. The Archbishop raised his voice. "And now, before I pronounce these two souls bound in holy matrimony, the groom must unveil his bride." This was the moment Julian had dreaded. His hand trembled slightly, the first break in his composure, as he reached for the edge of the veil. Around them, the church seemed to hold its collective breath. He could hear the rustle of fabric as people leaned forward, morbid curiosity overtaking propriety. He lifted the first layer, then the second, the third, the fourth. The final layer fell away. Julian froze. For a moment, he thought he must be hallucinating, that stress and sleepless nights had finally shattered his mind. This could not be real. It could not be possible. The woman before him was not scarred. She was not disfigured. She was, without question, the most breathtakingly beautiful woman he had ever seen. Raven black hair framed a face of such perfect symmetry that it seemed almost unreal. High cheekbones caught the light from the windows, full lips curved in the barest hint of a smile. And her eyes were a shade of violet so rare, so impossibly vivid, that they seemed to glow from within. They met his with a directness that sent a jolt through his entire body. Behind him, the church did not erupt in shouts, but in something louder. The collective, rising hiss of 400 shocked whispers. The words "deceived" and "exquisite" were sharpest, cutting through the stunned murmurs like knives through silk. Julian could not move, could not think, could not process what he was seeing. His carefully constructed plans, his resignation, his entire understanding of the situation, all of it crumbled to dust in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Camilla, for it was indeed Camilla, though nothing like what he had imagined, tilted her head slightly. When she spoke, her voice was low and musical, meant only for him. "Surprised, Your Grace?" The Archbishop, flustered by the commotion, raised his hands for silence. "My lords and ladies, please. The ceremony must conclude." He cleared his throat and spoke the final words with deliberate emphasis. "By the power vested in me by God and the Church of England, I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He turned to Julian. "You may kiss your bride." Julian hesitated for the first time in his adult life, not from disgust, as he had steeled himself for, but from something far more dangerous. Desire. It hit him with unexpected force as he leaned toward her. Camilla tilted her face up, those extraordinary eyes challenging him, daring him to complete the ritual. His lips brushed hers, the briefest, most proper of kisses, and even that fleeting contact sent heat racing through his veins. The church erupted in applause, but it sounded distant, muffled. All Julian could hear was his own racing heartbeat and the whisper of Camilla's breath as she pulled away. She smiled at him again, and this time there was steel beneath the beauty. "Shall we face our audience, husband?" They turned together to face the congregation, and Julian saw the full scope of what had just occurred. 400 of London's most influential people wore expressions ranging from shock to outrage to fascination. The whispers had already begun in earnest. Sir Reginald Worthington, Camilla's father, stood in the front pew looking immensely satisfied. The man had negotiated this marriage with the cold precision of a military campaign, and now Julian understood why. This was not an act of mercy toward a disfigured daughter. This was something else entirely, something he did not yet understand. As they processed down the aisle, Camilla's hand resting lightly on his arm, Julian felt her lean closer. Her words were barely audible beneath the organ's triumphant march. "I imagine you have questions, Your Grace." "That," Julian replied through clenched teeth, maintaining his smile for the benefit of their audience, "would be a considerable understatement. Then I shall endeavor to satisfy your curiosity. But perhaps we might survive the wedding breakfast first?" The wedding breakfast was held at Worthington House on Grosvenor Square, and it was nothing less than a spectacle of chaotic display. The same society that had pitied the poor scarred bride now swarmed around her with a fervor that bordered on frenzy. Ladies who had never bothered to inquire after her during her 8 years of seclusion now gushed about her beauty. Gentlemen who had written her off as unmarriageable now found excuses to linger in her presence. Julian watched it all from across the room, a glass of champagne growing warm in his hand. Lord Trenton appeared at his elbow, his expression hovering between amusement and concern. "Well," Trenton said, "this is not precisely what we anticipated." "No," Julian replied flatly, "it is not." "She is extraordinary, Julian. Surely you must see that." "What I see," Julian said, his voice low and tight, "is that I have been made a fool. I agreed to this marriage believing I was performing an act of charity. Instead, I find myself bound to a woman whose very existence is a calculated deception." Trenton studied him carefully. "Are you angry that she is beautiful?" "I am angry," Julian bit out, "that I was not given the truth, beauty or scars. I had a right to know what I was agreeing to." "Did you? Your father-in-law offered you £100,000. Would you have refused the money if you had known she was lovely?" Julian had no answer for that. He drank his champagne in one long swallow. Across the room, Camilla laughed at something Lady Hartwell said. The sound carried clear and bright, and Julian felt a sudden, sharp pang beneath his ribs. This was not how it was supposed to be. He had prepared himself for duty, for distance, for a marriage of convenience that would require nothing of him but his name and title. He had not prepared himself for desire, for attraction, for the dangerous possibility of wanting something more than financial salvation. As if sensing his gaze, Camilla looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Julian saw the challenge in hers once again. She excused herself from her admirers and moved toward him with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Trenton muttered something about finding more champagne and disappeared with suspicious haste. Camilla stopped in front of Julian, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of summer gardens. Up close, he noted a small beauty mark gracing her left cheekbone and the hint of a dimple at the corner of her mouth when she smiled. "You look as though you have swallowed something bitter, husband." "Perhaps because I have just discovered that the past 8 years of my understanding were built on lies." "Not lies," Camilla corrected, her voice pleasant but firm. "What society believes, Your Grace, is seldom the full truth." She glanced around the room at the watching faces. "This is hardly the place for such a conversation. Shall we attend to our guests?" There was something in her voice, a hardness beneath the cultured tones, that made Julian pause. He studied her more carefully, looking past the extraordinary face to the woman beneath. What he saw in her eyes was not triumph or amusement. It was wariness. "Very well," he said quietly, "but we will speak of this later, in private." "As you wish, husband." She gestured subtly at the crowd. They came expecting a tragedy. Instead, they got a scandal. The ton will dine on this for months. "And does that please you?" "It amuses me," she admitted, "though I suspect you find no humor in it." "No," Julian said, his jaw tight. "I find no humor in discovering that my wife is not the woman I was promised." Something flickered across Camilla's face. Hurt, perhaps, or anger, but it was gone so quickly that Julian wondered if he had imagined it. When she spoke again, her voice was cooler. "I am precisely who I have always been, Your Grace. Perhaps it is assumptions rather than I that have failed you." She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving Julian standing alone with the bitter taste of truth in his mouth. The journey to Winterborn Hall took 3 days. They travelled in Julian's crested coach, with Camilla's maid and Julian's valet following in a second carriage. It should have been an opportunity for conversation, for beginning to understand each other. Instead, they spent most of the journey in rigid silence. Camilla read. Julian stared out the window. When they did speak, it was with painful politeness about inconsequential matters, the weather, the condition of the roads, the scenery they passed. Neither acknowledged the vast unspoken tension that filled the carriage between them. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crossed into Derbyshire. The landscape changed from gentle, rolling hills to wilder, more dramatic terrain. Ancient forests pressed close to the road. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth like bones breaking through skin. "It is beautiful," Camilla said, breaking a silence that had lasted nearly an hour. "Harsh, but beautiful." Julian looked out at his homeland with critical eyes. "It is unforgiving land. It takes constant work to coax anything productive from it." "Is that why you needed my father's money? Because the estates are failing?" He should have been offended by such a direct question. Instead, he found himself answering with equal directness. "My father was a gambler, a talented one for many years. Then his luck turned, and he could not accept it. By the time he died, he had mortgaged everything, borrowed against everything, sold everything that was not entailed. The estate manager calculated that I had perhaps 2 months before the creditors would force me into debtor's prison. And so you sold yourself. I sold my name and title, Julian corrected, as your father bought prestige for his family that no amount of wealth could otherwise provide. It is the way of the world, Camilla. It always has been. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Did you resent it? The necessity of marrying me? The question caught him off guard with its vulnerability. Julian found himself choosing his words carefully. I resented the situation, the failure of my father, the burden of responsibility I inherited. But you? He paused. I believed I was doing my duty. I believed I was saving my heritage by accepting a marriage to a woman whose face bore scars. And now that you know the truth? Julian looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they had left London. But it was the sadness in her expression that caught at something in his chest. Now I find myself more confused than resentful. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. Confusion is better than contempt, I suppose. I do not hold you in contempt, Camilla. Yet you hold me at a distance. It was not quite a question. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Distance, he said finally, seemed the safest course for a marriage such as ours. A marriage of necessity. Yes, I see. Camilla turned back to the window. Then perhaps distance is indeed wise. You view this strictly as a restoration of your lands. I shall not burden you with expectations of more. The words were coolly delivered, but Julian caught the faint tremor beneath them. He had hurt her, he realized, and despite his determination to maintain boundaries, he found he regretted it. But before he could formulate a response, the coach jolted to a stop. The driver's voice called down from the box, "Winterborn Hall, Your Grace." Julian leaned forward to look out the window, and despite everything, he felt a familiar surge of love for his home. Winterborn Hall rose from the landscape like a medieval fortress that had been civilized by successive generations. The original Norman keep stood at the center, surrounded by Tudor additions and Georgian improvements. Ivy climbed the grey stone walls. Tall windows reflected the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful. It was ancient. And it was drowning in debt. "Home," Julian said softly. Camilla studied the hall with an appraising eye. "How many servants do you employ?" "Fewer than we should. I have been forced to make reductions." "And how many of those remaining are honest?" The question surprised him. "I beg your pardon." "Your father gambled away a fortune, Your Grace. Gambling men often have gambling servants, those who take advantage of a master too distracted to notice missing silver or altered accounts. If you wish to restore Winterborn, we must first ensure that those charged with its care are not bleeding it dry." Julian stared at her. It was not the response he had expected from a bride arriving at her new home. "You think my servants are stealing?" "I think," Camilla said as the coach door opened, "that desperate times create desperate people, and that a household in crisis is vulnerable to those who would exploit it. But that is a conversation for another time. For now, I believe we have an introduction to perform." The household had assembled to greet their new duchess. Julian watched as Camilla descended from the coach with regal grace, her traveling dress perfectly pressed, despite 3 days of journeying. The servants lined up in order of precedence, from the butler down to the scullery maids. What surprised Julian was how carefully Camilla observed each person, not with the dismissive glance of someone checking for curtsies and bows, but with genuine attention. She greeted the butler by name, Mr. Finch, whom Julian's father had employed 30 years prior. She commented on the housekeeper's keys, noting the organization of the household must be considerable to require so many. She was, Julian realized with growing unease, not at all what he had expected, in any respect. That night, they dined alone in the formal dining room. The table could seat 24, but place settings had been laid at opposite ends, emphasizing the distance between them. Footmen served course after course in silence. Julian watched Camilla over the rim of his wineglass. She ate with perfect manners but little appetite, pushing food around her plate more than consuming it, The candles cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the elegant bones, the impossible eyes. He thought about what she had said in the coach, about wanting to be ignored, about needing distance, about his plans for a marriage in name only. All of that would have been so much easier if she was scarred. The thought came unbidden, and Julian immediately felt ashamed of it. But it was true. An arranged marriage to a disfigured woman would have been simple, duty without temptation, responsibility without complication. Instead, he had married the most beautiful woman in England, and he had no idea what to do about it. "You are staring, Your Grace." Camilla's voice cut through his thoughts. She was looking at him with those violet eyes, her expression unreadable. "I apologize. Do you wish to ask me your questions now, about the rumors and the truth?" Julian set down his wine glass. "If you are willing to answer them." Camilla dismissed the servants with a gesture. When the door closed behind the last footman, she rose from her seat and walked the length of the table to stand closer to him. Not too close, propriety was maintained, but close enough that they could speak without raising their voices. "What do you wish to know?" "Everything. Start with why you allowed society to believe you were disfigured." Camilla was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but steady. "I was 15 years old when I made my debut. My mother had died 2 years prior, and my father thought a London season would help me overcome my grief. I was young perhaps, but not unusually so for a debut. And I was—" She paused, as if the words were difficult. "I attracted attention. Too much attention. The wrong kind of attention." Julian waited, sensing there was more. "There was a man, a marquis, older, powerful, with a reputation that should have warned my father away. But he was influential, and my father was eager to establish our family in society. When the marquis showed interest in me, my father encouraged it." "Showed interest how?" Camilla's jaw tightened. "He pursued me relentlessly. He appeared everywhere I went. He sent gifts I did not want. He requested dances I could not refuse without causing a scene. And then, one night at a ball, he found me alone in a garden." Julian's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "He cornered me against a wall. He told me I was his, that my father had given him permission to court me, that I should be grateful for his attention. When I tried to push past him, he grabbed me. He tore my gown. He tried to—" Her voice faltered for the first time. "He tried to force himself on me." Rage, hot and immediate, flooded through Julian's veins. What stopped him? My father arrived. There had been enough commotion that someone had gone to find him. But when I begged my father to confront the Marquess, to demand satisfaction, to protect me, he refused. The Marquess was too powerful, you see. He held all of my father's gambling vows from a disastrous night at cards. To challenge him would have meant debtor's prison for our entire family, the loss of everything we possessed. So he did nothing. He did worse than nothing. He wanted me to continue the acquaintance, to smile and accept the Marquis's attentions as if that night had never happened. He said I had misunderstood, that I was too young to comprehend the ways of society. But I knew Blackthorn would come back, and that my father, trapped by his own debts, would sacrifice me to preserve his financial ruin from becoming public knowledge. Camilla turned away from him, moving to the windows that overlooked the dark gardens. So I created a solution. I told my family that I had suffered an accident in our still room. That acid had spilled on my face. We announced to society that I was horribly disfigured, that I could not bear to be seen, that I was retiring to our country estate to recover. And the Marquess lost interest immediately. Why would he want a bride with a ruined face? I had ceased to be valuable to him. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. For 8 years I lived in seclusion. No one saw me. The few visitors we received were told I was too sensitive about my appearance to meet them. Society forgot about me, except as a cautionary tale about the dangers of beauty. Julian rose and crossed to stand near her, not touching but close enough that he could see her reflection in the dark glass of the window. "And your father allowed this? For 8 years?" "My father," Camilla said, "was relieved. It solved his problem without requiring him to confront a man who held his financial destruction in his hands. The Marquess lost interest in a disfigured daughter, and my father was no longer pressured to deliver me into that man's grasp. It saved him the difficulty of finding me a suitable match while maintaining the fiction of protecting me. I was safe, hidden away, no longer an embarrassment or a risk. Until he needed money. She met his eyes in the glass. Until he needed money, and then he remembered he had a daughter of marriageable age. A daughter whose supposed disfigurement would appeal to a certain kind of man, one desperate enough to overlook any flaw for the right price. A man like me. A man exactly like you, Your Grace, a duke with an ancient name and no fortune, perfect for our purposes. Julian should have been insulted. Instead, he found himself asking, "And the Marquis, what happened to him?" He married twice in the years I was hidden. Both wives died under mysterious circumstances. He is still very much active in society, still very much a rake of the worst kind. And now that I have reappeared, she trailed off. Now that you have reappeared, he will know you were never scarred. Yes, and he may seek to resume his pursuit. It is possible. Julian studied her reflection, the rigid set of her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. This was not a woman celebrating her triumph over society. This was a woman still afraid. Something shifted inside him. Yes, he had been deceived. Yes, his careful plans were in ruins. But Camilla had not deceived him out of malice or vanity. She had deceived him, had deceived everyone, out of desperation, out of a need to survive in a world that had failed to protect her. "His name," Julian said quietly. "I want to know his name." Camilla turned to face him, surprise evident in her expression. "Why?" "Because you are my wife, and whatever else exists or does not exist between us, that creates certain responsibilities. I will not allow any man to threaten you." For the first time since he had lifted her veil in St. George's Church, Julian saw Camilla's composure crack. Tears welled in her violet eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. "You would defend me, even though you resent this marriage, even though I am a complication you did not want?" Julian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, he took her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warmth of the room. "I am many things, Camilla, but I am not a man who would abandon a woman to danger. Whatever my feelings about our marriage, you are under my protection now. And I take that seriously." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Then she squeezed his hand once and stepped back. "His name is Silas Blackthorne, the Marquis of Thornfield." Julian felt his blood run cold. He knew that name. Everyone in society knew that name. Blackthorne was indeed powerful, indeed connected, and indeed known for his predatory behavior toward young women. The deaths of his wives had been whispered about, but never investigated. He was exactly the kind of man who could destroy a young baronet's family on a whim, and exactly the kind of man Julian now wanted to call out. "Thank you for telling me," Julian said. "I give you my word that he will not touch you, not while you bear the name Ravencroft." Camilla nodded. "I should retire. It has been a long day." "Of course." She moved toward the door, then paused. Without turning around, she said softly, "I did not mean to make your life more difficult, Julian. I only ever wanted to be safe." Then she was gone, leaving Julian alone with his thoughts and a growing realization that his marriage was going to be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The weeks that followed established an uneasy pattern. During the day, Julian managed the estates with renewed energy, bolstered by the knowledge that his financial crisis was over. He met with tenants, inspected properties, and began the long work of restoring Winterborn to its former prosperity. Camilla, meanwhile, took control of the household with an efficiency that stunned everyone. She dismissed 3 servants the first week, a footman who had been stealing silver, a maid who had been skimming housekeeping funds, and a groom who had been selling estate hay to neighboring properties. The discoveries were made so discreetly that the servants in question left without creating scandals, but the message was clear. The new Duchess of Winterborn was no one's fool. She reorganized the stillroom, establishing proper inventory controls. She reviewed all household accounts personally, catching inconsistencies that had been overlooked for years. She even negotiated better terms with local merchants, using her father's connections to secure discounts that saved the estate hundreds of pounds annually. Julian watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. This was not how he had imagined a duchess would behave. Ladies of quality were supposed to occupy themselves with needlework and morning calls, not account books and inventory lists. Yet Camilla excelled at it all. At night, they maintained careful distance, separate chambers, separate lives. They dined together when propriety demanded it, but conversation remained polite and surface level. Julian told himself this was what he wanted, what he had planned for. But lying alone in his bed each night, knowing Camilla was just down the corridor, Julian found sleep increasingly elusive. He thought about her violet eyes, about the courage it had taken to create and maintain her deception for 8 years, about the fear in her voice when she spoke of the Marquis, and he thought, damning himself for it, about the taste of her lips during their wedding kiss, brief as it had been. He was attracted to his wife, dangerously, distractingly attracted, and he had no idea what to do about it. Julian noticed, too, that Camilla watched the Morning Post with an intensity that bordered on dread. Each day when the butler brought the silver tray of letters, her hands would still over her teacup, her violet eyes fixed on the pile of correspondence, as if searching for a particular seal. When it did not appear, her shoulders would relax fractionally, but the wariness never entirely left her face. He did not ask what she feared, but he knew. One evening, approximately 6 weeks after their arrival at Winterborn, Julian found himself wandering the halls long after the household had retired. He had been working late in his study, reviewing reports from his estate manager, when restlessness had driven him out. He was passing the music room when he heard it, the sound of a pianoforte being played with considerable skill. The melody was melancholy, something in a minor key that tugged at unnamed emotions. Julian pushed open the door silently. Camilla sat at the instrument, her back to him, her long dark hair unbound and flowing down her back. She wore a dressing gown of ivory silk, and in the candlelight she looked like something from a painting. She was lost in the music, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced ease. Julian recognized the piece, a nocturne by John Field, full of longing and shadows. It suited the moment, suited her, suited the strange limbo their marriage had become. When the final notes faded, Julian spoke softly. "I did not know you played." Camilla started violently, spinning around on the bench. Her hand flew to her throat. "You frightened me." "My apologies. I heard the music and—" He trailed off, not quite sure how to explain his presence. "Could not sleep?" Camilla finished for him. "Neither could I." Julian moved further into the room, maintaining a respectful distance. "You play beautifully. Where did you learn?" "During my years in seclusion. I had little else to occupy my time. Music became a companion when I had few others." She gestured at the instrument. "This is a fine pianoforte. It must have cost a fortune." "My mother's. It was one of the few things my father did not manage to sell or gamble away, as it was part of her personal settlement." Julian touched the polished wood gently. "I have not heard anyone play it since she died." "I am sorry. Should I not have—" "No," Julian interrupted. "Please, it is good to hear music in this house again." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the space between them heavy with things unsaid. Camilla fiddled with the sheet music on the stand. "Julian," she said finally, using his given name for perhaps the 3rd time since their marriage. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you regret marrying me?" The question hung in the candle-lit air between them. Julian considered lying, considered offering a polite deflection, but something about the vulnerability in her eyes made him choose honesty instead. "I regret the circumstances. I regret that we are bound by necessity rather than choice. But you yourself? No. You are—" He struggled for words. "You are far more than I expected. More intelligent, more capable, more—" He stopped, unable to finish. "More beautiful?" Camilla supplied, and there was an edge to her voice. "More complicating to your careful plans?" "Yes," Julian admitted. "All of those things. And is that terrible, that I complicate your plans?" Julian looked at her, really looked at her, in her dressing gown with her hair down, in this moment of unexpected intimacy. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Part of me wishes you were as I expected. It would be easier. Easier to ignore me. Easier to maintain the boundaries I thought necessary. And now? Now those boundaries feel less clear." Camilla rose from the piano bench, and suddenly the distance between them felt very small. Julian could smell her perfume, could see the rise and fall of her breathing, could count the individual lashes framing those extraordinary eyes. "What if," she said softly, "we did not have boundaries? What if we allowed this marriage to be more than a transaction?" Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. Every rational part of his mind screamed warnings, complications, vulnerability, the risk of caring for someone beyond their utility. He had spent his entire adult life building walls against precisely this kind of emotional entanglement, but looking at Camilla in the candlelight, he felt those walls beginning to crack. He reached out slowly and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She shivered at the contact but did not pull away. "That would be dangerous," he murmured. "Yes. We would be risking the comfortable arrangement we have established. Yes. You might come to regret it." "Yes," Camilla whispered. "You might." The tension between them pulled taut as a violin string. Julian could feel himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force he had been fighting for weeks. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes fluttered half-closed, and then from somewhere above them a floorboard creaked, the unmistakable sound of a servant stirring in the upper halls. The spell broke. Julian stepped back, breathing hard. You should return to your chambers. It is late." Disappointment flickered across Camilla's face, followed quickly by resignation. "Of course. Forgive my forwardness." "There is nothing to forgive." But as she gathered her dressing gown and moved toward the door, Julian felt like he had failed some kind of test. When she paused in the doorway and looked back at him, her expression was carefully neutral. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Camilla." She left. Julian stood alone in the music room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, fighting the urge to go after her. This was for the best, he told himself, maintaining distance, keeping their arrangement purely practical. It was the only way to protect himself from the kind of emotional chaos his father had succumbed to. But as he made his way back to his empty chambers, Julian could not shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. The following week brought the event Julian had been dreading, a visit from Lord Trenton and several other gentlemen from London. It was meant to be a sporting party, an opportunity to show off Winterborn's excellent hunting and to solidify relationships that would benefit the estate. Julian had forgotten in the complexity of his new marriage that he had extended these invitations months ago. The gentlemen arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a cavalcade of carriages and noise. Trenton emerged first, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed Winterborn Hall. "So," he said as Julian greeted him, "how goes married life?" "Complicated," Julian admitted. "The beautiful Duchess treating you poorly." "The beautiful Duchess is treating me with perfect courtesy. That is the problem." Trenton raised an eyebrow but did not press. The other guests required attention. Lord Hartwell, Sir Peter Danbury, and Mr. E. Thomas Ashfield, all members of Julian's club and long-time acquaintances. That evening, the gentlemen gathered in Julian's study for brandy and cigars, while Camilla tactfully made herself scarce. The conversation ranged across various topics: politics, investments, the upcoming racing season, before inevitably turning to marriage. "You are a fortunate man, Winterborn," Hartwell observed, swirling his brandy. "That Duchess of yours is extraordinary. Not just beautiful, but clever. My wife remarked on it after your wedding, said she had never seen a woman manage a room the way the Duchess did at your breakfast." "Indeed," Julian replied, taking a drink to avoid elaborating. "Must admit," Danbury added, "we were all shocked when that veil came off. The rumors about her face, we all believed them, yet there she stood, lovelier than any woman in England. How did it happen? The supposed disfigurement that never was." Julian set down his glass with more force than intended. "My wife's past is not a matter for speculation." The room fell silent. Trenton shot him a warning look, but Julian was beyond caring. These men, his friends supposedly, were discussing Camilla as if she were a curiosity rather than a person. "I meant no offense," Danbury said carefully, "yet offense was given. My wife endured a terrible experience that led to her seclusion. That experience is private. I will not discuss it, and I will not tolerate others doing so." After an awkward moment, the conversation moved to safer topics, but when the other gentlemen eventually wandered off to their assigned chambers, Trenton remained behind. "You are defending her," he observed. "She is my wife." "You are more than defending her. You care for her." Julian moved to the window, staring out at the dark grounds. "What if I do? What difference does it make?" "It makes all the difference, Julian. When you agreed to this marriage, you were certain you could keep your heart separate from the transaction. But that Duchess of yours, she has gotten under your skin." "I do not know what I feel," Julian admitted. "I know that I am attracted to her. I know that I admire her competence and her courage, but I also know that caring for her, needing her, would be a weakness I cannot afford." "Why? Because your father cared for your mother and it destroyed him when she died? Because he turned to gambling to fill the void she left?" Julian whirled to face his friend. "Do not presume to analyze me." "Someone must," Trenton replied evenly. "You are so determined not to repeat your father's mistakes that you are creating new ones. That woman is your wife, Julian. She lives under your roof, bears your name, and from what I observed tonight, likely has feelings for you as well. Yet you hold her at arm's length because you are terrified of caring too much." "I am terrified," Julian said tightly, "of losing control, of becoming my father, a man so destroyed by love and loss that he gambled away his family's entire future. Your father was weak. You are not, and denying yourself happiness because you fear pain is simply another form of cowardice." The words struck like a physical blow. Julian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he could not, because Trenton was right. After his friend retired for the night, Julian remained in his study, drinking and thinking, about Camilla in the music room, about the way she had looked at him in the candlelight, about the moment he had almost kissed her and the cowardice that had made him pull away. Around 2 in the morning, drunk and reckless, he made a decision. He would stop fighting this, stop pretending he did not want his own wife. Tomorrow, he would speak with Camilla. He would tell her, what? That he wanted to try, that he was sorry for keeping her at distance, that perhaps they could build something real from their convenient arrangement. The alcohol made it all seem possible, simple even. But the next morning brought a letter that shattered Julian's tentative plans and introduced a threat he had not anticipated. The letter arrived with the Morning Post, distinguished by a seal Julian recognized immediately, a silver falcon on blue wax. The Marquis of Thornfield's seal. Julian opened it with growing dread. "My dear Duke of Winterborn, I must offer my congratulations on your recent marriage. How delightful that you have taken the Worthington girl as your bride. I knew her once, you see, before her unfortunate seclusion. We were quite close, as I recall. Imagine my surprise to learn that her disfigurement was not as severe as society had been led to believe. Indeed, I had the pleasure of seeing her at your wedding breakfast, and I must say she is as lovely as ever, more so perhaps with the maturity that years have brought. I shall be travelling to Derbyshire within the month on business. It would be remiss of me not to call at Winterborn Hall and renew my acquaintance with dear Camilla. I trust this will be convenient for you both. I remain, with highest regards, Silas Blackthorne, Marquis of Thornfield." Julian read the letter 3 times, each reading stoking his fury higher. The casual tone, the possessive language, the barely veiled threat beneath the polite words. Blackthorne knew. He knew about the deception, about Camilla's years of hiding, about everything, and now he was coming to Winterborn to stake his claim. Over Julian's dead body. He found Camilla in the still-room, carefully labeling jars of preserves with her usual precision. She looked up when he entered, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down her pen immediately. "What has happened?" Julian handed her the letter without preamble. He watched her face as she read, saw the color drain from her cheeks, saw her hands begin to tremble. "No," she whispered. "No, he cannot. He can and will, unless we stop him." Julian took the letter back, crumpling it in his fist. "Pack a bag, we are leaving for London immediately." "London? But why?" "Because I will not face this man on my territory, with guests in my house and servants who might gossip. In London I have allies. In London I can control the narrative. And in London," his voice went hard as stone, "I can ensure that the Marquis understands exactly what will happen if he comes near you again." Camilla stared at him. "You would confront him, a man with his power and connections. I would destroy him if necessary." Julian moved closer, taking her cold hands in his. "Camilla, listen to me. I have not been the husband you deserve these past weeks. I have kept you at distance, treated our marriage as a transaction, allowed my fears to dictate my behavior. But this I will not tolerate. Julian, you are my wife. You are under my protection. And that means something. It means everything." He squeezed her hands gently. "Trust me, please." Tears spilled down Camilla's cheeks. "I'm so afraid." "I know. But you do not have to be afraid alone anymore." Julian pulled her into his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, she collapsed against him, her body shaking with silent sobs. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, fury and protectiveness warring in his chest. The Marquis had made a grave mistake in threatening Camilla. He was about to discover that the Duke of Winterborn, when properly motivated, could be a very dangerous enemy. They departed for London that afternoon, leaving Lord Trenton and the other guests with apologies about urgent business that required immediate attention. If his friends were confused by the abrupt departure, they were too polite to say so. The journey passed in a blur of planning. Julian sent messengers ahead to London, calling in favors, arranging meetings, preparing for a confrontation he intended to win decisively. Camilla sat across from him in the carriage, unusually quiet. They were 2 days into the journey when she finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Julian looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "Doing what?" "Protecting me, fighting for me. You could simply allow the Marquis his visit, maintain polite society, and avoid any scandal or conflict. It would be easier." "Easier," Julian said, setting aside his papers, "is not always right." "That is not an answer." He studied her across the swaying carriage. They had shared this confined space for days now, and somewhere along the way, his feelings had crystallized into something he could no longer deny. "I am doing this," he said slowly, "because when I imagine that man touching you, speaking to you, even looking at you, I feel a rage so intense it frightens me. I am doing this because you are my wife, yes, but also because you are brave and intelligent, and you deserve better than to live in fear. And I am doing this because—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because?" Camilla prompted softly. "Because I care for you," Julian admitted, "far more than is wise, far more than I intended, and I will not stand by and allow anyone to hurt you." Camilla's eyes widened. "Julian, I know I have been distant. I know I have held you at arm's length. I told myself it was necessary, that maintaining emotional distance would protect us both. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I was afraid of becoming like my father, of caring so much that losing you would destroy me. But Trenton was right. Denying myself happiness out of fear is cowardice." He crossed the carriage to sit beside her, taking her hand. "I do not know if you can forgive my coldness these past weeks, but I am asking you to give me a chance to be the husband you deserve. Not out of duty or obligation, but because I want to, because you have become important to me in ways I never expected." Camilla was crying again, but this time she was smiling through the tears. "You foolish man, of course I forgive you. I have cared for you since you defended me at dinner that first night, since you asked about the Marquis with such genuine concern, since you looked at me like I was more than just a beautiful face or a financial transaction. You are so much more," Julian said fervently. "You are extraordinary." He kissed her then, properly this time, not the chaste brush of lips from their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and full of all the emotion he had been denying for weeks. Camilla kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands coming up to frame his face. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "When this business with the Marquis is finished," he murmured, "I intend to court you properly, to woo my own wife, as she should have been wooed from the beginning." "I look forward to it," Camilla whispered, "but first we have a predator to vanquish." "Indeed we do." They arrived in London 3 days later and took up residence in the Winterborn townhouse on Grosvenor Square. The house had been mostly closed for the past year, as Julian had attempted to economize, but now, with Camilla's dowry secure, he had the funds to open it properly. Julian worked quickly. He called on his solicitor, his banker, and several influential members of his club. He gathered information about the Marquis of Thornfield, his finances, his debts, his secrets. What he discovered was damning. Blackthorn's 2 previous wives had both died under suspicious circumstances, as Camilla had said. But what she had not known was that both women had attempted to leave him shortly before their deaths. There were whispers of violence, of isolation, of cruelty that never quite crossed the line into prosecutable offense. The Marquis was everything Julian had suspected and worse. He was a rake and libertine who had learned to operate within the bounds of society's permissiveness, using his rank and influence as shields. Julian intended to destroy those shields. The confrontation came 2 weeks after their arrival in London. Blackthorn had called at the Winterborn townhouse, requesting an audience with both the Duke and Duchess. Julian had agreed, but on his own terms. The meeting took place in Julian's study. He sat behind his desk, every inch the powerful Duke, while Camilla sat beside him, in a chair Julian had positioned deliberately. Not behind him like a timid woman seeking protection, but beside him as an equal partner. When Blackthorn was shown in, Julian did not rise. The Marquis was as unpleasant as Julian had imagined. 45 years old, running to fat, but still possessed of a certain brutal handsomeness. His eyes were calculating and cold as they fixed on Camilla. "Duchess Winterborn," he purred, "how delightful to see you again after so many years, and looking so well. The rumors of your disfigurement were greatly exaggerated, it seems." "They were entirely fabricated," Julian said before Camilla could respond. "As you well know, Thornfield." Blackthorn's gaze shifted to Julian. "I am sure I do not understand your meaning." "I am sure you understand it perfectly. My wife spread those rumors to escape your unwanted and aggressive attentions. She was 15 years old when you assaulted her in a garden. A child. That is a rather harsh interpretation of what? Of forcing yourself on a young woman who had repeatedly refused your suit, of tearing her gown when she attempted to flee, of threatening her reputation if she reported your behavior." Julian's voice was hard as iron. "I have spoken to witnesses, Thornfield. I know exactly what you did." Blackthorn's expression darkened. "You would take the word of a hysterical girl over that of a peer of the realm. I would take the word of my wife over that of a man of your known reputation." Julian stood now, deliberately using his height to tower over the shorter man. "You have come to London hoping to resume your pursuit. Allow me to save you the trouble of trying. The Duchess is not available. She is not interested. And if you attempt to contact her, approach her, or even speak her name in public, I will ruin you." "Ruin me?" Blackthorn laughed. "You overestimate your power, Winterborn." "Do I? Let us review." Julian picked up a file from his desk. "You are in debt to the tune of £50,000. Your estate manager has been embezzling from you for years with your tacit approval. He keeps you in funds for gambling. You allow him to take his share. Your first wife attempted to flee to her family 2 days before she fell from a horse. Your second wife told her sister she feared for her life 1 week before she mysteriously drowned in your lake." Julian set down the file. "Letters, ledgers, witness statements. 1 word from me, and the Lord Chancellor will open investigations into both deaths. The scandal will destroy you. Your name will become synonymous with the worst kind of villainy." Blackthorn had gone pale. "You cannot prove any of this." "I can prove enough. And even if I could not prove it in a court of law, I can prove it in the court of public opinion. Society will ostracize you. Your clubs will revoke your membership. Your family will disown you to preserve their own reputations. You will be utterly and completely ruined." "For what? For attempting to renew an old acquaintance? For threatening my wife?" Julian moved around the desk, getting into Blackthorn's space. You preyed upon a 15-year-old girl. You made her so afraid that she destroyed her own reputation and hid herself away for 8 years. You stole nearly a decade of her life, and now you have the audacity to come to my home and attempt to intimidate her again." Julian leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Leave London, Thornfield. Return to your estate and stay there. Do not contact my wife. Do not attend events where she is present. Do not even think her name, because if you cross me on this, I will not merely ruin you socially. I will see you brought before the magistrates. I will drag your name through every scandal sheet in England. I will ensure that when people speak of you, it is only to spit." Blackthorne stood frozen, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. For a long moment, Julian thought the man might attempt to strike him, but then he seemed to realize the hopelessness of his position. "You have made a fatal enemy today, Winterborn," he said finally, his voice low and venomous. "Both of you. Enjoy your Duchess while you can." Blackthorne cast one last venomous look at Camilla, who had sat silent and dignified throughout the entire confrontation. Then he turned and stormed from the room, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Julian returned to Camilla's side. She was trembling, but when she looked up at him, her eyes were clear. "Is it truly over?" "It is truly over. He will not dare approach you again." Camilla stood and threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. Julian held her tightly, feeling the last of his own tension drain away. They had won. The threat was neutralized. Camilla was safe. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me, for protecting me, for caring enough to fight." Julian tilted her face up to his. "I will always fight for you. Always protect you, because you are not just my wife, you are the woman I love." The words surprised him even as he said them, but the moment they were out, he knew they were true. Somewhere between their wedding day and this moment, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Camilla Ravencroft. She stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "You love me?" "I love you. I think I have loved you since the moment I lifted your veil, and saw not a scarred bride but the most beautiful, courageous woman in all of England. I was simply too stubborn and afraid to admit it." "I love you too," Camilla said, laughing and crying at once. "I have loved you for weeks and thought you would never feel the same, thought you would always resent me for complicating your careful plans. My plans were foolish. My plans did not account for you." He kissed her, and this time there was no fear, no hesitation, no walls between them. This time it was simply a man and a woman, bound by marriage and now by love, claiming each other completely. When they finally broke apart, Julian smiled. "Come, let us return to Winterborn. I have a great deal of courting to make up for, and I intend to start immediately." "What about your guests?" "We left them rather abruptly." "They are gentlemen. They will understand." He paused. "Though Lord Trenton will be insufferable when he learns he was right about everything." Camilla laughed. "Then we must face his smugness together." "Together," Julian agreed. "Everything from now on, together." They returned to Winterborn Hall the following week, and the change in their relationship was immediately apparent to everyone. Julian was attentive and affectionate in ways that surprised the staff. Camilla glowed with happiness that transformed her from merely beautiful to radiant. Julian made good on his promise to court her properly. He arranged picnics in the gardens. He read poetry to her in the library. He brought her flowers from the hothouses. He taught her to ride the wilder paths of the Derbyshire countryside. And every night, instead of retreating to separate chambers, they retired together to the Duchess's suite, where they talked for hours before falling asleep in each other's arms. The ton talked, of course. The sudden reappearance and subsequent disappearance of the Marquis of Thornfield caused some speculation, but Julian's careful manipulation of information ensured that the whispers worked in their favor. It became known that the Marquis had attempted to impose on the Duke of Winterborn and had been firmly rebuffed, that he had gambling debts and questionable business practices, that his estates were in disarray and his reputation deserved closer scrutiny. Slowly but surely, Blackthorne's influence waned. He withdrew from society, retiring to his country estate where he could harm no one else. The investigations Julian had threatened never materialized. They were unnecessary. The mere threat had been enough. By autumn, Camilla discovered she was with child. The news filled Julian with a fierce joy he had never imagined feeling. He became even more protective, if such a thing were possible, hovering over her with concern that made her laugh. "I am not made of glass," she protested one afternoon, as Julian insisted she rest instead of helping with the household accounts. "You are carrying my child," he replied, "the heir to Winterborn. You will rest and eat properly and allow the servants to wait on you." "You are being ridiculous." "It is from love that I insist." He kissed her forehead. "Indulge me." She did, because she loved him, and because she knew that his protectiveness came from a place of deep care. The baby, a daughter, was born the following spring. She had her mother's black hair and miraculously the same rare violet eyes, and they named her Eleanor. On a warm June afternoon, nearly a year after their tumultuous beginning, Julian found Camilla in the garden. She sat on a bench beneath an arbor of climbing roses, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. The scene was so perfect, so achingly beautiful, that Julian had to pause just to take it in. Camilla looked up and smiled. "Come sit with us." Julian settled beside them, putting his arm around his wife and gazing down at his daughter. "Do you remember," he said softly, "what you said to me in the music room that night, about allowing our marriage to be more than a transaction?" "I remember." "If I had known this peace was possible," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would not have delayed a moment in seeking it." "Then it is a good thing," Camilla replied, her eyes glistening, "that we have a lifetime to enjoy it." Julian smiled and pressed a kiss to her temple. "I expected to marry a scarred bride, to fulfill a duty and nothing more. Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for. And I expected a cold marriage of convenience, a safe prison in exchange for financial security. Instead, I found freedom and love and home." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun moved across the sky, painting everything in shades of gold. Eleanor stirred and made a small sound, and Camilla began to hum a lullaby, the same melody she had played on the pianoforte that night in the music room. Julian closed his eyes and let the moment wash over him, the warmth of the sun, the scent of roses, the sound of his wife's voice and his daughter's breathing, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He had married for money and necessity. He had been deceived about the nature of his bride, but he had found, against all expectations and through considerable difficulty, the one thing he had never believed possible for himself. He had found love, and that made all the difference. Dear listener, true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to trust despite it. Sometimes the very walls we build to protect ourselves become the prisons that keep us from the happiness we deserve. If you find yourself holding back from connection, from love, from the vulnerability that true partnership requires, consider this. Safety found in distance is often merely loneliness by another name. May you find love that fights for you, partnership that gives you strength and the courage to accept both when they appear. Tonight, as you rest, know that your story continues to unfold in ways you cannot yet imagine. May you find the courage to open your heart when the right person appears. Thank you so much for joining us on Julian and Camilla's journey from deception to devotion. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to open your heart to love. Your support helps us continue creating stories of courage, redemption, and happily ever after.